Mhm. Share my screen. And so, yeah, this is what we're going to do for today is just give a definition of psychology, look at some of the goals, look at a few of the myths about people's perceptions of the field of psychology, go into some kind of philosophical areas that traditionally, at least from the Western perspective, psychology has tried to analyze using more scientific methodology other than philosophical methodology. And then we'll look at some of the different camps, ideas dealing with people like Sigmund Freud and behaviorism and those fields to kind of give a grounding for where we're headed when we're going to be talking about culture in the course. So, and I think I mentioned this on Monday that the definition of psychology, of course, ology, as you may know from other classes, means knowledge or study of. Um, but the term psyche translates to mind. But if we look at the Greek word mind, but if we look at the really roots of the term, it's literally translated as breath. Okay, because as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this on Monday. Um, what the Greeks believed is that when you take your first breath when you're born, you breathe in your mind or your soul, as you would say. And then when you take your last breath, you breathe it out. Okay. Now, for the Greeks, there is no differentiation between the soul and the mind. Okay. Literally, they're talking about the same thing, which we'll get to here in a minute when we talk about dualism, whether our mind and body are separate or if our mind and body are one and the same. And so we're going to look at this because this is an argument that really is still of debate today, whether we have a soul, this thing we call a soul or an independent mind from from our physical existence, our physical body. Okay. Um, Skipping down here to kind of a more basic modern definition is psychology is now defined as this scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Okay, kind of giving it a little bit more definition than this broad term of mind. Okay, and what do we mean? So scientific, when we're talking about it in the field of psychology, is we use a set of methodologies that then guide us to some conclusion. Sometimes we prove it, sometimes we don't. I will tell you that using the scientific method and coming up with a hypotheses and testing hypotheses, about 95% of our experiments that we do in the field don't actually provide evidence for something. And so there's lots of studies going on behavior and mental processes that are around the world, but literally most of them don't go the direction that the experimenter wants it to. Okay. The other reason we use a scientific method is we want to see if I get a result in my study, if someone replicates it, will they get the same result? Okay. And you may know in recent years, in some of the popular media, it says psychology has a replication crisis because a lot of studies that did show significant effects were replicated, and it's shown that they weren't replicable. So, what my goal for this class will be is to make sure that we only look at studies that have a good standard and that have been replicated to provide evidence for whatever we're talking about. Replication is really important when we're talking about cross-cultural psychology, okay? And this is where the cultural component is because what we really want to know in the field when we're looking at some standard rules about behavior, why people behave the way they do, or a mental process, which we'll get to here in just a minute, We want to know if that's a common experience of every human being, regardless of culture, regardless of where they live, regardless of those things, because that means that those are kind of general laws of behavior. Whereas if we see differences between cultures when we replicate studies, we know that there's in one culture, it may be valid, but it may not be valid for other cultures. And we'll look at some of these differences. We can even study even simple cognitive processes, and we find that sometimes those are not replicated when we do it cross-culturally, and we'll get to that later in the course. When we're talking about behavior, we're talking about things that as an experimenter, you can observe and measure. So the example here, you could see someone cry because they were exposed to something emotional. Okay, that's something observable. We can observe things like reaction time. If we get into neuroscience, we could observe the brain imaging as someone is thinking about or is behaving in some certain way. Okay. So when we talk about behavior, it's anything that we can directly observe. Okay. When we're talking about mental processes, those are things that as psychologists and experimenters that we don't have direct access to. Okay. So we don't have direct access to your memories. So if we asked you something about your childhood, we would need to go through you. We'd have to go through your interpretation of your experience and see if it fits with some model we're trying to test. Okay. Now, in our more modern time, especially with the advent of brain scanning, brain imaging technology and stuff, there has been a small movement in psychology that suggests that we should be called the study of the brain because everything we do, we try to go back to some process within the brain. Okay. So, for example, even in my dissertation, where I was studying social behavior, I was studying loneliness and I was studying social identity, is I had to have at least one chapter on the neurological processes when someone is lonely or they're reflecting on their identity. Okay. Now, some of the issues with this is the brain isn't the best predictor of behavior, believe it or not. Actually, self-report is still the best way to predict whether a person will do something or not. So while these brain studies are kind of cool, they're not always the best method when we get to one of the goals of psychology, which is to predict behavior. It's not one of the best predictors of whether someone will do something or not. Okay. Going back up to this point, psychology is both a science and a profession. So, for example, in my career experience, my master's degree was in a professional area called industrial organizational psychology, where I would go into organizations and use the scientific method and the knowledge we have about behavior in the workplace to increase productivity, for example, or increase job satisfaction or something like that. My doctorate degree is more in the science end, where I study specifically loneliness and social identity and their relationship with each other and how they influence our physical and mental health. Okay. In either case, whether it's science or profession, our real goal is to improve the human condition. Even if it's just understanding basic behavioral and mental processes, we want the knowledge to be used for positive change for individuals and for communities. So, all right, so that's the definition. And then if we go, so if that's the definitions, what are the goals? And we basically have four goals when we're looking at any behavior or mental process, okay? The first goal, if we start at the top here, is just purely descriptive. It's being able to name and classify various observable, measurable behaviors, okay? In this, we're just trying to give something a definition. So if I use, for example, a clinical observation, we may see a cluster of people who have depressed moods, have very low motivation, um, uh, have sleeping issues, eating issues. They're not able to function very well and going to work and taking care of themselves and family. And we may say that this cluster of behavior is something unique. And so we describe it and maybe we give it a label of depression. Okay. That and that's the label we give for it. Okay. So the second thing we want to do in the field is then we want to understand, okay? This is being able to state what are the causes of that behavior, okay? And so within depression, we know that there's biological correlates dealing with the serotonin and dopamine systems. We know there's social issues such as difficulties relating with other people or understanding or things like rejection, those types of things that deal with. And then we know there's psychological issues. For example, people who suffer from clinical depression do something called ruminating, where they say, for example, I'm a horrible person. And then they go through their day looking at everything that proves to them that they're a horrible person. And at the end of the night, they say, I'm a bad person. So they're in this cognitive loop, as you would say. And of course, part of the treatment is to stop those thinking processes and challenge whether they're actually true or not. Okay. So though that's understanding the causes of it. But then once we know the cause, we want to predict um, uh, when a person will have more symptoms, as you would say, for example, or predict when an individual will go through a depressive episode. What conditions need to be placed for a person to have depression? Is there life experiences? Is there biological or genetic components? And then, of course, one of the controversial parts of psychology, when we're not dealing with trying to help someone, is controlling behavior. In the context of depression, we want to know what type of treatment modality can we put in place to alleviate those depressive symptoms. Okay. Now, I will say that in other areas of psychology, this part can get a little bit more dark, and it hasn't always been used for good. So you can think of things like using psychology to do manipulation within groups or within individuals and those kinds of things. So it's not always altruistic with this goal, and that's why it's kind of one of the more controversial ones. But for the most part, psychologists want to improve the human condition. So in the guise of clinical psychology, we want to know what can alleviate the symptoms of depression. All right, so that's kind of the basic example of what we try to do. And we will try and use this process when we're understanding culture and how culture influences human behavior. So we're going to describe certain conditions such as human development, personality, social behaviors. And we'll look at it from a cultural perspective. So how does culture help us understand it, predict it, and control it? Okay. So kind of keep these main goals in mind as we move forward, because that's kind of the blueprint that we're going to use as we explore how culture influences our behavior. All right, so again, this is an intro kind of component. What are some of the myths about psychology? or misconceptions. One that usually always comes, this is usually in the introduction component, is psychology is all about mental health. And while that myth is kind of can be understandable when we look at, for example, the American Psychological Association, I believe is about 52% of psychologists who are members of that are counseling or clinical psychologists, those who work within the mental health field. What makes this a myth is that psychology is much broader. As I mentioned, my master's degree and my doctorate degree, while they want to know the influences on mental health, the idea is I want to know what conditions make a person lonely and how does their identity play a role in that. Okay. And other psychologists just want to know, for example, cognitive psychologists, basic thought processes and the like. Okay. The second myth is psychology is not a science. And again, this myth is understandable. There's a lot of wannabe people who claim to be psychologists or know a lot about psychology, and they write popular books and nothing based within science. But when we're talking about psychology in the academia, we're talking about the scientific method, and we're talking about how can we understand things from an objective and scientifically subjective perspective. Okay. And then the third myth that I like to hit is psychologists can read minds. And so if you become a psychology major or you're a social worker, counselor, and you announce that, you'll always inevitably get the person in the room who says, oh, so you're analyzing me. Oh, you're reading my mind. Watch how he watches my behaviors. And the truth being is, if you ever run into somebody who is a student of psychology or a psychologist and says they can do that, they're really full of it. We cannot read minds. We can't do those kinds of things. And so that being said is, yes, sometimes it is fun to say, yes, I am, and see what the reaction is. But in the end, you got to be honest. So those are kind of the three myths that for this class, I kind of wanted to go over as we move along. Okay. Okay. So now what I want to do is spend some time talking about some of the classical problems in psychology. And reason I bring these up is because these are things that we find when we go into any culture that most cultures kind of struggle with in wanting to understand. And I will say, even with our modern technologies and stuff like this, you might assume that we have it down pat, but there's still areas where we can wonder if it's correct or not. Okay. So the first question, and we're going to use kind of some Western folks to talk about this in the beginning, but as we'll see, there's a lot of different perspectives dependent upon culture. Okay. And the first classical problem in psychology is what's called the nature versus nurture debate. Okay. What influences our behavior more? What were inherited traits from our parents or the environment we're in? And so the two people who we can look at in this debate in the Western societies is two Greek philosophers known as Plato and Aristotle. Okay. Give you just a little bit of background. Both of these individuals were students of Socrates. And this is a very truncated, simple thing. It's a lot more complex than this, but for the sake of our discussion here, I'm going to simplify some the issues that happened between Plato and Aristotle. When Socrates left his school, as we would say, Aristotle assumed that it would be his, and so did Plato. But what Socrates did is he left it to Plato. And so that left Aristotle with a bad taste in his mouth. So he kind of left and went to create his own school. Okay. Based upon what Plato's experience is he noticed when he observed human existence, he observed that people in that time usually were born and they ended up doing the same career, as you would say, as their parent. So if they were born a farmer, they were more likely to be a farmer. If they were born a merchant, they were more likely to become a merchant. If they were born into royalty, they'd more likely to be royal. And this is where Plato said that this must mean that our basic traits, who we are inherited from our parents. It's in our blood, as you would say. Okay. So based on that, he created the nature part of um, um, uh, that we're born with our traits and who we're going to be. Okay. And if you think about this, this is why, for example, in Western cultures, if you wanted to be part of royalty, you had to have royal blood. And the lineage of great people are done on a bloodline. Okay. This is a reason, part of the reasons we look really close at family trees to see where our bloodline comes from. Okay. Now, on the other side of it is Aristotle. Aristotle, when he left, he was very much a naturist, and he was a keen at observation, and he was actually one of the first in Western culture to classify animals into classifications and give us the foliage of what's the difference between a plant and a weed, as an example. Okay. Um, but what he noticed in his observations of the natural world is that if a plant is planted somewhere where it doesn't have the right amount of water and the right amount of sunlight and the right kind of temperance for that plant, the plant will start to whittle and die. Okay. And this is where he came up with the argument that nurture, human experience, our environment makes us who we are. And so it's experience versus what we're born with for Plato and Aristotle. And in our modern times, we still struggle with this debate. Today, we put it in terms of how much who I am is due to my genetics versus my experience. Okay. And we can see this debate when we get to personality. If you look at studies of personalities, we do something called the uh, quotient, the genetic quotient, which is this calculation of the percentage of who we are as far as our personality is concerned is due to genetics versus experience. Okay. But the issue we have with this is if you look at studies with that look at the genetics of personality, it ranges greatly. There's some studies that you will read that says 20% of our personality is due to genetics. And there'll be other studies who go up to almost 60% is due to our genetics. So even within the scientific field, and even as much as we know about the genetic code, it's really still really up to debate about how much of who we are due to genetics versus due to experience. Um, and so, but when we look at this again, we look at this from a cross-cultural perspective, we will see that there's still caste societies who really still kind of do in their culture kind of take that Platonic idea that people are born into their system of where they belong. And then we'll see other societies where it's about experience and giving, for example, a child a variety of experiences to help them develop fully into who they are. Okay. And we'll see this kind of play out as we move along in the course. The next kind of debate that is ongoing is the mind-body problem. Okay. And the two philosophers that we'll look at when we're exploring this is Rene Descartes and John Locke, who were two Enlightenment era philosophers. Um, and what we're going to see is that Descartes is going to look at things as more of a um, we do because of our um, that the mind and body are separate, excuse me, and they're two separate entities. And where he's going to get this idea from is walking in some German gardens. And in this garden, there's statues that are hooked up to a hydraulic position that when you stepped on a stone, the statue would start to move. Okay. And this is a simplification of Descartes' idea. But from that idea, he said, in order for that statue to move, there needed to be something that acted upon it. There has to be some external entity for that machinery to work. And that's how he kind of saw the human body is a vessel or a machine. Okay. And so what he felt is that there had to be some external entity to us that acted upon our body to make it so we thought and we behaved and do all the things we do as human beings. Interestingly, he put the mind in the pituitary gland because it is one of the only features in the brain that is centered almost in the middle of the brain, but it's not symmetrical to the left or right lobe. So it's kind of this P-shaped object that isn't necessarily symmetrical. If you take a biology class, you know that the pituitary gland is a gland. It excretes hormones or tells our body which hormones to excrete. So probably not the mind, but that's where he put it. Okay. John Locke, on the other hand, we get his ideas with his treatise on man. Okay. And if I were to kind of give kind of a, if I had, for example, Thomas Jefferson submit the Declaration of Independence to our class, and we had something like Turnitin that catches plagiarism. I would actually have to fail his paper, the Declaration of Independence, because it was largely plagiarized from John Locke's treatise on government and people. What John Locke argued is that in order for everyone to be equal, we have to be born with a blank slate that then experience writes upon. If I were to put it in modern terms, if every human being was equal to one another, we can't be pre-born with inherited traits because then we're born different from each other. Okay. And so we must be born with blank hard drives, putting it in modern terms. And then as we go through experience, that's when we start installing the software, we start installing the memories and all of those things into our hard drive. Okay. So for John Locke, the mind and the body are one and the same. They're not inseparable from each other. Okay. So again, you might think that in our modern times we have solved this problem, and because we know that the brain is associated with so many functions. If you take out part of the brain, you lose functioning in some area of the body. And so, once the brain is gone, the person is passed away. And so the brain must be that thing that is controlling us. And because the brain is a biological process, that indeed there is no separation between mind and body. Okay. However, when we dig some holes into this, is most studies on the brain are correlational studies. They're not experimental studies, especially the brain imaging studies that we have in our modern time, is that we observe someone doing something and we observe activity in a certain part of the brain. But the question is we don't know what came first, the behavior or the brain process. Okay. The other difficulty of the mind-body problem from at least a scientific perspective is that, yes, we can say that the brain is kind of the CPU, the operating system for our body. But what's missing is when we look at the study of consciousness, this is our awareness of who we are and what we're doing. It's an awareness of our past, present, and potential future. It's how we're able to contemplate on who we are and our relationship with other people's, that idea of consciousness is that, sure, we can look at the brain and we can see what areas are activated when we hear sound, what areas are activated when we see something and touch something, what areas activate when we're thinking about math or something like that. But the problem is we don't know how that electrical processing within the brain translates into experience. If I put it in simple terms, so we know that the brain probably is a good CPU unit, but we haven't located the speakers or the video screen. We don't know how that electrical activity gives us the experience of sound and vision and experience. So while we can see that activity in the brain, where you could assume that, okay, the brain is giving way to that, we don't know how. Is there an external entity that is interpreting that electrical information that then gives us our experience? So those are some of the things we're still debating. And we'll also see here in just a little bit, when we look at other cultural perspectives, they don't bother with this mind-body thing. They say, yes, there's a separation, but there's life experience and then there's spiritual experience, which we'll see here in just a moment. And so different cultures will look at this from a very different lens than we have, at least in the traditional academic Western perspective. And so that's this becomes a more complex thing when we start viewing it from a cultural perspective. All right. We're actually just not going to pay attention to this one. That's more for intro to psych type stuff. But we are going to look at this nature of man, okay? And when we look at the nature of man philosophy, what we want to know is, are people primarily evil, self-centered, self-indulgent, or are people good, altruistic, helping? Which is it that we are? And so there are two philosophers. These people came after our previous ones, Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes was an English philosopher. Rousseau was a French philosopher. And both of them are going to look at nature to try and answer this question about the nature of man or human beings as a whole. Hobbes is going to look at nature, and again, this is a big simplification. Hobbes looked at nature and he saw the destructive forces. He saw earthquakes, volcanoes, predators and prey, and all of these things. And he says, if the world is destructive, humans are destructive. And therefore, humans are born naturally bad or to the tendency of destruction. Okay. Rousseau, on the other hand, is going to say that he's going to look at nature and he's going to see this beautiful symmetry. So yes, we have violent volcanoes, but that volcano gives way to more land, nutrients for plants, wildfires, they burn, but then there's growth. We have the cycle between predator eats, prey and predator, and the relationship between those two. So predator eats prey, predator defecates, that creates growth and food for the prey. And so he's going to say that there's this good cycle between people, between nature, and therefore people are born good, and we become evil when we deviate from nature. Okay. Um, and so let's just take real quickly a look at how this has an influenced from a cultural perspective. When we look at culture, we see that, for example, United States and Great Britain and a lot of the United Kingdom took on Hobbes' perspective. Okay. And you can see it in our criminal justice system. You can see it in our laws and rules, is that what they became to believe is that the reason why we need government, the reason why we need criminal justice systems is because we need to temper man or human beings' natural tendency to be destructive and hurt each other. Okay. So the purpose of government is to control people's natural tendencies towards evilness. Okay. And so if you look at, for example, our criminal justice system, it's based on a punishment system and a separation system where a person does something bad, we view them as bad people. So we incarcerate them away from the rest of the people and put them in some type of negative condition that they deserve in our minds to live in. Okay. And that's the purpose of laws and rules and the like. Rousseau's going to, again, countries that take on Rousseau's things. So we could look at the Nordic countries, Denmark, and those from at least the Western type of countries. They're going to say that no, people are good. It's just when we get away from who we are that we tend to do bad behaviors. So when we look, for example, in their criminal justice system, they take a rehabilitation perspective where if you literally, I think, for example, in Denmark, going to prison is almost like going to a spa. The rooms are set up for a good human healthy condition. They're fed well. They're provided treatment. They're provided freedom of movement. They're provided all of these things because in their context, what they're trying to do is bring that person back to their natural state as a good, decent human being. Okay. So a crime is not to be punished. It's to bring that, when a person commits a crime, it's about bringing them back to the community, bringing them back to their natural good state of being. Okay. Now, which model is correct? Well, we can do some comparative studies, when we look here in the United States and Great Britain, recidivism rates for crime are like 60% on first offenses, whereas in the Nordic countries, they're about under 10%. And so, this is still of large debate. When I look at this, I think of social psychology findings in the field of altruism. Okay. As human beings, we've always debated, are we these selfish, um, 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 thriving beings? And if you look at our news, we may assume that we are, that we see the rich wanting to get richer, take advantage of the poor, all of those other things. But when we look at human behavior on a day-to-day basis, we find that people will act against their own self-interest. So we can see, for example, in California right now, people helping their neighbors and trying to put out fires. We can see the firefighters and all of those people putting themselves in danger. It's not within their best self-interest to help others given the risk, but they do it anyways. Okay. And so, is there something to be said about whether people are selfish versus altruistic? I think this is still up for huge debate because we do know that there's people who help to manipulate, but for the most part, we're finding in research people help just because they have that drive to help other people. Okay. And so we'll look at this again when we get to cultural, cross-cultural things and how other societies view whether we're these evil human beings or we're good. I will leave it at kind of something that Philip Zimbardo said. Everyone has a propensity for good and evil. It cuts through the heart of each one of us. It is dependent upon the situation that will and our experience that determines whether we will be evil or will be good. So something to kind of think about on that end. Okay. So I had mentioned that on all of these problems, there's different views of them. Okay. And so I want to bring up an awesome philosophy, and I want to be very careful with this because one of the things that I've learned on the Tana Otham Nation and everything is that there's a lot of interpretations of these philosophical questions. Okay. And so, and the reason why I like this is because if we can't just clump people into one category and say, oh, they all think in the same way. On the Tana Otham Nation, there are different views and philosophies dependent upon where that person was raised within the nation, their experience with the teachings from their grandparents and parents, and all of these things. This awesome philosophy that I'm bringing up was done by a past elder, and he was also an instructor for the college, Camillus Lopez Bott, who came up with philosophies with the man in the maze and all of these types of things. And he was considered an elder of the community. This is his take on the whole mind-body problem and duplicity of life, and what he feels is the philosophy. Okay, he agreed with this idea that I brought up from Zimbardo, that there's duplicity in life. Individuals have the tendency for both good and evil. And he brought up the example of the Bon, or in Western terms, the coyote, who was in traditional stories both a deviant kind of jokester that kind of liked getting people in trouble. But then whenever the community was in trouble, he was also someone who would come and help the community. Okay. And he used that story of the coyote in Otham Bon to show this duplicity in life. Okay. He also argued that there's actually three aspects to the individuals, not just a mind and a body. Okay. He believed that there we do, the idea of the physical self, that we have a biological processes that obey the rules of biology and digestion and all of those types of things. And that we also do have a mind. But he separated the mind and the soul and spirit. He said the mind is something of our worldly knowledge, the knowledge we gain to survive in our physical world right now. Our soul and spirit transcends the mind and body. Okay. So in a way, he took kind of both a monistic view, because in the world we live in, he kind of combines the physical body and the mind. But then he also has a dualistic perspective that he says there's something that transcends the physical mind and body, and this is the thing we call the soul or the spirit. Okay. I bring this up because it's a good example of one Native American philosophy that says, now, wait a minute, we can have a physical mind and physical body, but we also can have this thing that transcends the physical world. Okay. So that's one philosophy to kind of consider from at least a local elder that passed about a year ago. So he's greatly missed. So that's the philosophical ideas. And I apologize if I'm going too quickly on this. I want to just get this introduction part done so that we really can get into the cultural aspects. And so if I'm moving too quickly, I apologize about that. But I do want to go on and talk about some of the different camps and ideas and theories that have been developed in the field of psychology. And unfortunately, we have to start with a gentleman that is mostly associated with psychology, Dr. Sigmund Freud. Um, and I'm not going to get into his theory or his thing, but the thing that I want to note about Sigmund Freud is he did note two things that we will see from a cultural perspective. He noted that our body, our behaviors and whatnot are controlled by unconscious processes, that there are influences on the way we behave and the way we act that are not necessarily within our conscious ability to control, that we don't choose all the time how we behave. Um, and I'll give kind of two parts of this and a cultural example. If you remember on Monday, I mentioned when we were going through the syllabus, I mentioned that we all have kind of biases and these prejudices that we learn about from our culture that are deeply ingrained based on our culture. And in order not to act on those, we have to have good cognitive resources not to. Okay. But then I mentioned how sometimes we can act prejudice and discrimination as our stress level increases. Okay. And this is part of it. When we look at it from a cultural perspective, this is where the unconscious mind and how we were raised and our culture plays a huge role into behaviors that we may not even want to engage in, such as prejudice and discrimination. But when we don't have our full faculties because of stress, we can act upon those cultural influences that tell us, who's in, who's out. Of course, here in the United States, we base a lot of prejudices on skin color, gender, those kinds of things. And as we see, even the most well-intending people, um, uh, when they become heavily stressed, their behaviors can be driven by those cultural perspectives. For example, here in the United States, basing your opinion on skin color. Okay. So that's one thing that we need to note, especially when we're talking about cultural influences, is that there is culture that we may not even like about our culture that sometimes can drive our behavior. Okay. The other thing that I want to note as we look through the influences of these different camps is Freud did note the importance of early childhood development. Okay. For him, the huge part of who we are, our personality, our emotions, how we interact with each others, are really based on those early childhood experiences between about the age of 0 to 7. Okay. Now, a lot of people disagree with his model because it was a very, if you have children around, please plug their ears. It was a very sexual model that children did achieve some outcome based on the satisfaction and gratification of some sensual need. And in Freudian terms, sensual is spelled sex. Okay. Now, that's kind of where a lot of people have disagreed with Freud, even some of his followers. But that idea of early childhood experience is a very large determinant of who we become. And if we and probably a more basic example of this is when we look at gender differences in children. Okay. Technically, if we dressed our children the same, gave them the same haircuts, all of those things, we technically wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a boy and a girl until they start going through pre-puberty, when they start to develop their secondary sex um, um, attributes, okay? Meaning that in early childhood, children are androgynous, okay? That you really couldn't tell unless, um, 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 you were giving a child a bath. I'll put it that way. Um, but what culture does is it uh, makes sure that there's a clear defining difference between biological girls and biological boys. Okay. And we will see through the study of culture and gender that each culture takes a different view of what it means to raise a girl versus raising a boy. Okay. And we will see that this has changed over time. For example, the notion of pink and blue. Okay. Before, I can't remember her name. Theodore Roosevelt's wife. Can't remember her name. There were two events that happened here in the United States early in the 20th century. But before the 20th century, your color choices for children were white clothing. Um, Eleanor, yes, thank you. Eleanor Roosevelt, yes, thank you. So I'll bring her up here in just a minute. Or it was actually seen as pink was a royalty color, and therefore males, as quote unquote dominant Western individuals, pink was a male color, blue was a female color because blue was seen as more kind of mellowed out. It wasn't as bright and vibrant as the pink colors. So when children did wear colors, it was usually boys wore pink, girls wore blue. But two things happened. Thank you for giving Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt showed up to her husband's inauguration dressed in pink. Following that, the Sears catalog, now coming out in color, started putting girls in pink and boys in blue. Okay. And that then became the differentiation in our culture about pink being for girls and blue for being boys. Again, before those two occurrences, it was actually opposite. Okay. And this is where a good example of popular culture comes into play and how popular culture can drive the way we view things as simple as gender. So two popular cultural events happened, Eleanor showing up to inauguration in pink, and then Sears catalog publishing pink clothes for girls, blue clothes for boys, changed the color based on gender. Okay. And so we do know that, and again, that influence, that differentiation of gender comes from what our culture expects boys and girls to act as. Okay. And when we get into the developmental section, we'll look at several other examples when we look at things like toy play, all of those things, and how culture has influenced that versus not. So again, the thing that I want you to think about as far as Sigmund Freud when it comes to a cultural perspective, even the things we don't like about our culture can unconsciously influence our behaviors, especially the more and more we become stressed. And two, early childhood is an important developmental point where we learn who we're supposed to be within a given culture. And we take those traits on with us into adulthood. Okay. And then the other camp that we should talk about is a camp called behaviorism. So I'll just give a quick overview of behaviorism. Behaviorism came out of the field of psychology because they felt psychology was becoming more philosophical. If you look at Freud's theory, for example, it's not scientifically measurable. There's no scientific method that you could prove or disprove Freud's ideas. And so they felt that psychology was moving towards philosophy. And so the behaviorists wanted us to be a science. And in fact, they wanted us to be a natural science. And so what they decided to do is to say, so the only thing like natural science that we should be studying in the field of psychology are those things that are observable. And what can we observe? What can we observe? We can observe stimuli in the environment and the behavioral reaction of the individual. Okay. And so for about 40 years here in the United States, that's the only thing that we studied. Well, not the only, there were a few other influences that broke this chain, is stimulus response psychology. And we erased the mind, the soul out of psychology. Okay, because we felt, if we look at B.S. Skinner, he said consciousness is just a byproduct of stimulus response associations. Okay. And the other thing that behaviorists did, though, is because a lot of experiments on behavior really can't be conducted with human beings, is they came up with this idea of anthropomorphism, that we can study animals and we can translate that into human behavior. So the same behavioral reaction in an animal can give the same behavioral, can do the same thing. So reward, punishment, associative learning, and those kinds of things. Now, today, when we look at behaviorism, we still use a lot of their scientific methodology, which I won't get into this class. But the reason why behaviorism really hasn't lasted is that human beings don't always fit that stimulus response association. And also the measurable rewards aren't always the same. And this is where we get into some cultural perspective. For example, what people find rewarding in a Western culture is not the same as the reward in, for example, an Eastern culture or a more collective culture. Okay. And we'll get into this more as we move along through psychology. But the point I want to make for this is when we get into culture, the reward for behavior differs between cultures. And so we can't just put everybody into one little box and say that if you reward this person, it's that same reward should work for another person. Okay. All right. The next camp is something called humanistic psychology. Okay. Humanistic psychology came into Western, at least our American experience, because they were kind of tired of these, what we call deterministic models. Okay. If you look at Freudian psychology, the reason you are here today is not because you chose to, but instead your unconscious mind is trying to satisfy some basic need that it has. Okay. In behaviorism, you didn't make the choice to be here either. You're here because of accumulated rewards and punishments that led you here. You didn't make the choice to come to school. It's been predetermined by a series of rewards and punishments through your life. Okay. But what the humanistic psychologist said is, then why do we live? What motivates us to who we are? Okay. And they developed what is called the humanistic approach. This is where that comes out of during the time of what's known as existentialism philosophy. To kind of give a little bit of background on this really quick, existentialism was really popular in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. After we just went through 2 world wars, we're in all of these conflicts across the world and everything else. And so the existentialists came along and said that we're not born into meaningful existence. We're born into a chaotic, destructive world. Okay. And that in order for us to control the chaos we're born into, we create meaning in life. So we create education systems, we create governments, we create all of these things, we create religion in order to give meaning to our life in this meaningless universe. Okay. They use this to determine that that means people have free will. We have the ability to decide who and what we believe in and how we believe in it. We have the ability of choice. Okay. Coming on the humanistic section is what we're trying to do with our free will is to determine what the best version of us is. So we're all trying to seek out this human potential of who we are. Okay. Now I'm going to leave this as a cliffhanger because I see that I promised that we were going, well, I only said that we'd go till noon, but we're a little bit over time. So I'm going to leave you with this idea and we'll get to the cultural aspects of this on next Wednesday. But I do want to take some time before we're out of class time. So I want to stop the recording